So, in the past few months, when it really seems like the end of the world in America and a lot of other places around the globe, I actually got into a game that I haven't played in a really long time. Plague Inc. I believe it was called something else while it was just a flash game on the computer. And it's been enjoyable for like a few weeks and then I got bored of it. But being the geography nut that I am, I found some oddities with the map to say the least. And I understand it's not trying to be 100% realistic, but there's some things that, even from a gameplay perspective, I just think don't make any sense whatsoever. And especially with some of the boundaries, it just seems like it's completely random. By the way, fellas, I know it's been a really long time since I posted on this channel, and to be honest, that's mainly because over the past couple years, it feels like I've been running low on energy. So all the energy that I do have, I feel like it would just be a waste to, spend it on a more extraneous channel. But I've been wanting to do this video for a long time, and a lot of people are asking me for extra content. So here we go. Let's jump into it. So starting with North America, Canada actually got a bit bigger because they actually included Alaska with Canada, which in the game makes sense because I understand it would get really complicated to try and have exclaves of different countries. They do this for every single country in the game actually, because I understand it would be really complicated to have like two parts of different countries that you have to keep track of, or they could have just made Alaska its own country altogether, but that wouldn't really jive well with a lot of people. But interestingly, they did make Greenland its own country, even though in real life it's actually more of a part of Denmark. And Greenland, I believe in the game, is the country with the least amount of people, which is really interesting. And it's kind of become a meme on the internet over the years that Greenland is like the hardest to reach, which is it can be true in the game from what I've seen. Greenland and Madagascar and Iceland, which is nearby and also doesn't have too many people. And then moving down south, you just have the United States, the contiguous United States, not including Alaska or Hawaii, which, I mean, that's like 99% of the population of the United States anyways, so that doesn't make too much of a difference. But what's interesting is in this game, Hawaii and other Pacific Island countries are just completely gone. Like, other than New Zealand, Australia, and Papua New Guinea, all of the Pacific Island countries are gone, which I really think is a waste of an opportunity. They could have had, like, the Pacific Islands be like one of the last locations that you have to infect. And that would have been a real challenge because they are like extremely isolated in real life. Like, you don't have to make them all separate countries, but just have like, Pacific Islands as a country. I mean, that's like what, 3 or 4 million people right there that live in the Pacific Islands. So, I mean, that's way more than Greenland or Iceland. And then you have just Mexico, pretty standard. You have the entire Caribbean that's included as one country, like 45 million people. That's pretty interesting. I understand why they did that because it'd just be way too hard to include all of the tiny little islands and territories as their own, their own countries that you have to infect. So they just have it included all together. But that kind of doesn't make sense in real life because you have like very strict borders between some of these countries, like the Dominican Republic and Haiti and Cuba and a lot of these other countries. Like, they have a very different migration policy. And with Puerto Rico, Puerto Rican and American citizens can just go back and forth whenever they want because they're part of the same country. Well, at least Puerto Rico is a territory of the United States. And as for Central America, they included all of them from Guatemala to Panama. Again, that's like 45, 50 million people. I understand why they did that because there's a lot of movement between these countries, and I guess they're kind of like, if you infect one of them, infect all of them. You don't want to have these smaller countries, but I'm just saying it'd be a lot more interesting if they did have every single separate country that you have to infect, even the small ones. That'd be really interesting, but I imagine the computing power that would take would be a lot more. You probably wouldn't be able to run it on a phone if that was the case, or at least not my phone. My phone's pretty crappy. But moving on to South America, you have what looks like Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, and the Guyanas all included in one country, which that's it doesn't really fit like with the other countries. I think Ecuador should have been included with Peru, if anything, and the Guyanas really should have just been their own thing. I mean, well, even with Colombia and Venezuela, from my understanding, they have a pretty strict border between them. So, if one of them was infected, it wouldn't necessarily mean the other was infected. And they just have Peru, which is its own thing. I mean, okay, it doesn't really make sense because Colombia has way more people than Peru, but Colombia is included with all these other countries, but Peru's just its own thing. Okay. Bolivia is also its own thing, but what's kind of strange to me is they include Paraguay and Uruguay with Brazil. And Paraguay and Uruguay are not, I mean, culturally, they do have a bit in common with Brazil. Uruguay, I believe, used to be a state of Brazil, but they never really adopted Portuguese, and their culture is a lot more similar to Argentina. And Paraguay really is just its own thing, just like isolated in the middle of South America. So it's a bit strange, especially since Paraguay is kind of like just jutting out of Brazil. It's not aesthetically pleasing at all. And then this last one is going to upset a lot of people. They included Chile with Argentina, just in one big country called Argentina. And I believe they have the Falklands in that. I'm not sure. Either that or they just leave the Falklands out of it entirely, like it's not on the map. Now, I kind of understand because Chile would be a kind of difficult country to implement. But, I mean, including with Argentina, I mean, they're entirely different countries. They do have a bit in common culturally, and there is a lot of migration back and forth between them. But Chile's a pretty large country, and especially when you look at some of the other choices they made, which, I mean, okay, so for the Americas, we kind of have a theme that we're having like medium to large countries in North and South America. So that's the criteria that they're going with. So when you look at Europe, it's kind of strange that you have Iceland, which is pretty small population and area, but it is pretty isolated. So it makes sense that it would just be its own thing. They have Norway, Sweden, Finland as their own countries. They don't just like put them into one giant country like Scandinavia, which if you were following the criteria from North and South America, they should have done that, but they didn't. I don't know, maybe just they're giving a bit more detail to the areas that they think that they would have players in. Germany includes the Netherlands and Denmark, but not Austria or Switzerland for some reason, but we'll get to that. The Republic of Ireland is included with the United Kingdom, which I'm sure a lot of people would really not be happy with. I mean, they could have just made Ireland its own thing, but it'd be kind of complicated with the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Like, are you going to make the whole island of Ireland its own thing? And you have Belgium included with France. That makes sense. In the south of Belgium, they do speak a lot of French. Spain is a country which includes Portugal. For some reason, it's just called Spain instead of like Iberia. Italy, okay, that's its own thing. And then they have Central Europe, which stretches from Switzerland to Moldova. And that's a bit strange. I mean, you're including countries that have almost nothing in common with each other. I mean, Switzerland, Hungary, Moldova. I mean, I guess the geography is similar, but it is in a really weird shape. Doesn't really make any sense to me, but that's what they went with. I would have rather gone with I would have split Romania, Moldova into its own thing. I probably would have included, Slovenia is included with these countries. I would have included Slovenia with the country to the south, the Balkans, which includes Greece, Bulgaria, most of the former Yugoslavia. And they also have Ukraine, that's its own thing. And then they have Poland, which is just Poland. It's one of the few countries that's completely untouched. And then you have the Baltic states, which includes Kaliningrad, which is currently a part of Russia, and Belarus, along with the 3 small Baltic states. And then you have Russia, strangely enough, which includes the Caucasus region, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, which if I was making the game, I would have just made the Caucasus just its own region. I mean, it's It does have quite a bit of people. I think it's like nearly 20 million people. And then nearby to that, they have Kazakhstan, which is just its own country. They have Central Asia, interestingly, which is the traditional definition of Central Asia, meaning all of the Stan countries except Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Kazakhstan. So that's actually quite a bit of people. These countries are growing very quickly. And then they have Iran, Turkey, Iraq, and then they have the Levant, which, I mean, let's be realistic. This country could never exist in real life. You would never have just free migration from Israel to Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan. That would never happen. But I understand it's a testy issue. It's very dicey, especially with Israel and their Arab neighbors, and not to mention Israel, like the actual country of Israel, has a very, very small land area, and it would be pretty hard to see on the map. So I get it. And then they have Arabia, including Kuwait, Bahrain, all the Gulf Arab countries, and Yemen, which I think that's like 70 or 80 million people. That's a lot of people, especially when compared to, some of the smaller countries, countries that you see, like the Baltic states, which only has like 10 million. So Yemen could easily be its own. And the kind of situation in Yemen is very different from these other, wealthier Gulf Arab states. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But moving on to what I think is the weirdest decisions that they made is Africa. Now, look at some of the criteria that we've seen for the past, some of the other regions that we went over. And this just makes very little sense whatsoever. So they have the countries that are untouched: Egypt, Libya, which Libya doesn't have a lot of people, but it's a fairly large country. So I understand why they made it its own thing. But they included Tunisia, which has more people than Libya, but in a much smaller area. They included that with Algeria, which, if anything, I think Tunisia should have been included with Libya. But that's what they went with. Okay. Sudan, I believe this country, I believe this game came out, like the original Flash game, came out before South Sudan became an independent country. So it makes sense that South Sudan is included with Sudan, but maybe they should have updated the map. I don't know. And then they have one of the strangest, just weird, unpleasing to look at conglomerations from the Horn of Africa to Mozambique and Zambia called East Africa. And it's strange for quite a few reasons, because number one, they have this big chunk taken out of Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. Just this huge chunk from the Congo to, I believe, Lake Victoria. And it's weird. It's really weird. It's literally I believe it's the only example on the map where their country lines in the game just completely disregard the real life international boundaries. Like, there are no international boundaries that go from the Congo to Lake Victoria. Even if you included Rwanda and Burundi, they don't border that. So they just took two arbitrary lines and connected it to Lake Victoria for some reason. Really weird. I don't know why they did that. Maybe just because they wanted some other neighboring country to border this huge lake. And one reason that East Africa is really unesthetically, it doesn't look very good, is because they just take out Zimbabwe for some reason. So you have this huge region of over 100 million people. They call it East Africa, but they don't include neighboring Zimbabwe, which only has like 16 million people. What's the reason for that? I don't know. Maybe because Zimbabwe is a bit more... I don't know. Maybe because they have a bit different migration patterns than the others. And then they have, strangely enough, Botswana, which Botswana only has around 2 million people in real life. So why is it its own country in the game when neighboring Namibia, which also has about 2 million people, and Lesotho and Swaziland are included with South Africa, which I'm sure they would not like that because Namibia and I believe Swaziland used to be a part of South Africa, but then they gained independence. So you just have, the criteria is completely all over the place. It's like completely random, and I don't see any gameplay reason for this because when I'm playing the game, whenever I infect East Africa or South Africa, you can guarantee that Botswana and Zimbabwe are not far behind. I mean, sometimes they're some of the last countries, like if Africa doesn't get infected very quickly, but I don't really see the gameplay advantages for this. It just makes it more extraneous. Doesn't really, and it just looks really ugly, in my opinion. I think if they're going to do anything, maybe just have Botswana and Namibia be its own thing, and then include Zimbabwe with Zambia and maybe Malawi as well. And then the Horn of Africa should definitely be its own thing, separate from East Africa. And then, of course, you have Madagascar, but interestingly, the neighboring countries in the Indian Ocean, like Mauritius, Comoros, and some of the other smaller territories, are just completely gone. I think that it would have been really interesting if they had these Indian Ocean countries, kind of like the Pacific Islands, if they just made it their own thing, like their own country. That would be maybe even more difficult to infect than, say, Madagascar or Greenland. And then moving on to the rest of Africa, you have Angola, which is just all of Angola minus the exclave of Cabinda, which is included with Central Africa, which is stretching from the Congo to Chad and Cameroon, but interestingly includes this little slice of East Africa to Lake Victoria, which I really don't understand why they did that. I don't know. It's kind of silly why it bothers me so much, but it just doesn't make sense, and it's not. I don't know. Maybe I just have a little bit of OCD because it's not congruent with the other criteria that we see. Like, nowhere else on the map do you see international borders cut through so flagrantly like here. There's just no point, in my opinion. It doesn't make sense. And then you have West Africa, which is just massive. I mean, when you compare it to some of the other regions, that's like easily 300 million people in West Africa. I mean, Nigeria alone has almost 200 million. So it seems like they could have added a little bit more detail here to, kind of make it a bit more challenging to get Africa. And also one of the most difficult countries in Africa to infect is freaking Morocco, which, interestingly, you can infect East Africa through Arabia, through a land border, even though they don't share a land border in real life. There's actually, I believe, like 100-mile strait in between the two. And there's an even smaller strait in between Iberia and Morocco. So it doesn't make sense why you could infect East Africa by land from Arabia, but you can't infect Morocco by land from Iberia, because it's way closer, and I imagine there's a lot more crossing going on through the Strait of Gibraltar than the Strait of Hormuz. But, well, okay, now we're just getting, like, extremely nerdy. So, looking at the rest of the world, the rest of Asia, you just have Afghanistan, Pakistan. As for the Kashmir region, I don't really know what they did with that. I understand it's a very controversial issue for South Asia and China to a lesser extent, but I don't really think they had this game in China, so it doesn't matter. India includes, interestingly, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. But I think that if they made Iceland its own country, they really should have just made Sri Lanka its own country as well. Sri Lanka has way more people, like over 20 million people, so it's on par with like Madagascar or Australia, but it's just included with India. And Bangladesh, same. I think they could have made it its own country, but I guess it's kind of smallish, but it has like 180 million people, so I don't get why they would do that necessarily. Oh, and one interesting thing here is with China, they include all of Mongolia, which there's just no reason for that. I know Mongolia doesn't have a lot of people. It's like 3 million. But there are other cases where you have countries with 3 million that are way smaller, like Botswana and maybe another one. I don't know. But Mongolia, it's way larger than a country like Botswana. And it has more people. It has a little bit more people, about 1 million more people. And yet it's just included with China. There's no reason. It could have been its own country, but I don't know. Maybe they were just getting lazy. And now Bhutan, I think. Bhutan is a little mountainous country in between Nepal, India, and China. And to include it with China is a very controversial move, especially now that there's a lot of tensions between Bhutan and China. And Bhutan is much more of an ally to India than it is to China. and there's a lot more movement between India and Bhutan. I don't even think you need a No, you need a passport. You don't need a visa to go from India to Bhutan. And India, along with Bangladesh, is one of the few countries where you don't need I believe what they have some kind of tourist price that you have to pay every single day that you're in Bhutan. It's outrageously expensive, but Indians and Bangladeshis don't have to pay it. So there's not free movement in between these countries like there is in between Nepal and India, but there's definitely a lot more movement in between Bhutan and India, and I think they might have a bit more in common than China and Bhutan. And here's another weird one that I understand why they did it, but it doesn't make any sense in real life. North Korea and South Korea are included as just Korea. I get why they did that, but they could have easily made North Korea its own thing, especially because, I mean, if they were going for realism, now, if they wanted, I mean, the game has no problem referencing, like, you have a little hotbar at the top, and it references current events and politics all the time. So the game has no problem referencing real life politics. So I mean, it could have been really interesting. It could have been a really interesting mechanic if North Korea and South Korea are one of the only land borders that the disease cannot cross. So it would be if you start in North Korea, you have to go to China. That's the only country, or China or Russia, because this is the only countries that you could cross into through the land border. You cannot cross the land border from North Korea to South Korea, or vice versa. So the only way you could infect South Korea is like by land or air, which is the only way you could get to the country anyways. So looking at, I believe Taiwan in the game is a part of China. Actually, it's kind of funny. I just checked the game and Taiwan does not exist on the map. Taiwan is just gone, along with Hainan Island to the south of the PRC. But that's hilarious that Taiwan is just wiped off the face of the earth in the Plague Inc. map. They also have neighboring Southeast Asia, which is basically all the mainland Southeast Asian countries: Burma, Vietnam, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. And then they have Malaysia and Indonesia included as Indonesia, along with Brunei and Singapore. And then they have the Philippines, which is just Philippines. But interestingly, they include the western half of New Guinea, which is currently a part of Indonesia. They include that with Papua New Guinea, the country, as just New Guinea. Which, I mean, I kind of understand why they do that, but in real life, I believe there's a lot more travel between Irian Jaya, that's the Indonesian half of New Guinea. There's a lot more travel between Irian Jaya and the rest of Indonesia than there is between Irian Jaya and Papua New Guinea. So if Papua New Guinea was to be infected, it wouldn't be by Indonesia most likely. It'd most likely be like by Australia or China. Now, again, with the Pacific Island countries, they're just gone. No Fiji, no New Caledonia, no Vanuatu, no Solomon Islands. In fact, the smaller islands of Papua New Guinea, like New Ireland or New Britain, they're just gone, completely wiped off the face of the map, which is really jarring, especially when you consider like how detailed the map is in some areas, and then some islands are just wiped off the face of the earth. It might have been for gameplay reasons, it might have been for aesthetic reasons, or in the case of Taiwan, it might have been for political reasons. You know, they don't want to upset the wrong people. And then they just have New Zealand, which is strangely way farther north than it is in real life, which probably is for gameplay reasons because they don't want it to be too out of the way. So, you know, kind of understand that. So really, if I were to change this map, I know this is extremely nitpicky and nerdy because 99% of people who play the game are going to, you know, look at these borders and be like, whatever, it's fine, I don't care. But I think that if you wanted to have like a Plague Inc. 2, you know, like, hey, I'm here. You can hire me. I can help you design the map. You know, we could try and hash it out. You can even split up some countries if you want. Like, you know, Russia in this game is just a massive country. Maybe if you want to split that up in, maybe you could call them, you know, regions. instead of countries. It make a lot more sense. And I would just add more detail to the different countries and maybe include some, some of the factors we see in real life, like the DMZ in between North and South Korea. That would be a very interesting mechanic. If you can't pass through the DMZ in between North and South Korea, and like North Korea would be extremely hard to infect. Or an area like the Pacific Islands might also be pretty hard to infect. Or you could go down to the individual state level for the United States or province level in Canada, but now that would require, I know that would require a lot of computing power. Well, maybe not. I don't know. Uh, I mean, I know on the computer you see a lot more detail than on mobile devices, but I don't know. Maybe they could make it happen in the future and add a lot more seaports and airports because it really seems to be lacking in a lot of areas. For instance, Istanbul, they don't have an international airport for Istanbul in the game, which is really weird because I believe it's one of the busiest airports in the world that carries traffic from Europe to the Middle East and Africa and Asia and all over the world and even North America. But I understand that including all of these would probably just be way too much time and detail for, a pretty simple game that you can get away with, you can get away with just, I don't want to say cutting corners because I know they probably spent a lot of time on the game, but some of it, in my opinion, just doesn't make sense. So, thank you all for watching and listening to me ramble about such a strange and, out there topic, but thank you all for watching. I want you all to know that I'm going to be putting in a lot more effort. Just, sometimes with views going down, it's just extremely disheartening. But, I think if I just have more fun with it, try to, just do more of what I want to do. And I think I'll be a lot more productive. So, I hope you all stay safe in these trying times with this, extenuating circumstance. And I don't know, but download the game for yourself. Have fun. Thanks for watching, everyone. I'll see you next time.